those who want to read Émile Durkheim himself, for the first time I am giving you page numbers. Although you have to read from back to back this book, but so far as etiology of society is concerned, you can read only book 2, social causes and social types, from page number 145 to 241. In the last class, I discussed two etiology in a relationship with each other, namely altruistic suicide and egoistic suicide. And the quotation which I read was, high egoistic suicide rate is symptomatic of the way the individual is structured into the society inadequately. On the other side, high altruistic suicide rate is symptomatic of the way the individual is structured into the society over-adequately. Now, this quotation was from the first English edition of 1955, and when I read it again in the second edition published in 1979, there is slight change in the language. In both the versions, the matter, the message, the substance, the content is the same, but in the second edition, the Durkheimian sentence goes like this. He said, and I am quoting from page number 217, that is 217, from the second edition published in 1979. Durkheim said, and I am quoting in direct narration, if excessive individuation leads to suicide, insufficient individuation has the same effects. Now, in the earlier sentence, I had read high egoistic suicide rate is symptomatic of the way the individual is structured into the society inadequately. Now he is saying the same thing, but the language has changed. Instead, he said, if excessive individuation leads to suicide, comma, insufficient individuation has the same effects, full stop. When man has become detached from society, he encounters less resistance to suicide in himself, and he does so likewise when social integration is too strong. Now, for the second sentence I had read yesterday, on the other side, high altruistic suicide rate is symptomatic of the way the individual is structured into the society over adequately. Now, what has changed between the first edition published in 1951 and the second edition published in 1979 is that instead of saying that the individual is structured into the society inadequately, or instead of saying that the individual is structured into the society over adequately, they are saying that if excessive individuation leads to suicide, insufficient individuation has the same effects. When man has become detached from society, he encounters less resistance to suicide in himself, and he does so likewise when social integration is too strong. Now, what is the main difference? That in the earlier edition, the focus was much more on social solidarity or social structure. And in the second edition, the focus is much more on individuation and less on social solidarity or social structure. In my personal opinion, and I may be wrong, the first edition is much more in tune with the language of Durkheim in French. Now, we must remember that Durkheim had died in 1917, and the first English translation was published in 1951, and the second English translation, that is the revised version, was published in 1979. Now, since I am a very orthodox student of classical theory, therefore, I am not amused by improvisations over the original. Therefore, I am fussy about what the original author wanted to convey, and I am not ready to buy the argument that the translator, with the counseling of a new set of advisors, has revised the original translation for the benefit of the readers or the audience. This is the logic people give in revision of the translations. Now, one can understand when the author is himself revising the text. But for an orthodox classical student of sociology, this is difficult to buy the argument that the translators have, revised the original translation. Therefore, this again falls into the politics of translation or sociology of knowledge through translated texts. Anyway, let us come to the page 219 in the second edition, which has not altered the first edition. And here, Durkheim is saying, suicide accordingly is surely very common among primitive peoples. Now here they have done a little better, because in the first edition, Durkheim was talking about lower societies. Now they have substituted a lower society with primitive people. This is slightly better in my opinion, but I will bring in Andre Bete, who has written in his celebrated essay, Tribes and Civilization, that there are two types of tribes in the world which had been studied by anthropologists. Tribes in Indian civilization and tribes outside Indian civilization. Now what Andre Bete says becomes very pertinent when we are reading the revised English translation of 1979, because Andre Bete said, and you can read it in ebook form. There may be article, Tribes in India or Tribes in Indian Civilization. Bete is saying that tribes in India are part of the civilization, whereas elsewhere tribes are outside the civilizational boundary. What does it mean? Bete said that usually the tribes in India are the real peasants. Peasants cannot be translated as farmers, because farming can be part of a modern economy also. Agriculture can be an occupation of farmers as well as peasants. Andre Bete said that the defining feature of a tribe is their uniqueness in social ecology. Tribes in India, in Indian subcontinent, in the nation state of India also, are much more integrated in the matrix of Indian nation state or Indian society, sociologically speaking. What does he mean by it? He is not sermonizing or making a prophecy. He is giving empirical examples on the basis of which he makes this distinction. What he said is that tribal societies elsewhere are not only separate from the civilized settlement, rather there is very little interaction between the tribes, peoples of the tribe and people of civilization. The transaction, the temporary economic transaction or secular transaction takes place, but it is not direct, it is rather through the middleman. Whereas in India, from times immemorial, tribal villages and so-called Hindu villages, are much more interlinked. Even today, in the rituals of Hindu marriage, at least in North India, there are certain rituals which are performed in any house by the tribal people of that location. On the other hand, Andre Bhakti said that whenever a Hindu or a Jain or a Buddhist person renounces life, he or she leaves the village or the town and goes to the forest, and in the forest they live among the tribal people. In other words, the tribal people in Indian civilization, according to Andre Bhakti, are not considered inferior or less developed in the cultural sense of the term. Rather, tribes in India are segregated from caste only in the sense that they have their own language, whereas the language of the scheduled caste people or lower caste of Hindu society share the same language which is spoken or written by the dominant elite or the super elite. Are you getting the point? Therefore, one has to be careful about this term primitive. Now, low society was in Durkheim a society which uses low technology, low energy consuming technology. But when you translate low societies of Durkheim into primitive society, primitive community, it has both racial connotation and Orientalist connotation. Now let us come to the point. Durkheim is saying, of course I am reading, not Durkheim in original French, but in English translation, because most of you are supposed to know the English language in JNU, Sociology department, and not French or Hindi or Spanish or Portuguese. This is institutional limitation. Therefore, but all the facts above reported about suicide, namely altruistic suicide, fall into one of the following three categories, and please make a note. Altruistic suicide rate data has come primarily from three segments. Number one, suicides of men on the threshold of old age or stricken with sickness. Second, suicides of women on their husband's death. Third, suicides of followers or servants on the death of their chiefs. Now, this is not Durkheim, this is me, although he has himself given the examples from India. He had written on page number 223 that India is the classic soil for this sort of suicide. In other words, according to Émile Durkheim, altruistic suicide is much more prominent in India and the countries related with India culturally. basically India and parts of Asia. Now, why? And here I think for the first time, I do not agree with Émile Durkheim, because he had got a bad translation about the Indian culture. Read with me what Durkheim has said. India is the classic soil for this sort of suicide. The Hindu was already inclined to self-destruction under Brahminic influence. This is his sentence, and I have my own take about this. Then he had, the second point on the same page, and here he deals with us, the Buddhists. Though Buddhism had often been accused of having carried this principle of, self-destruction to its most extreme consequences and elevated suicide into a religious practice, it actually condemned it. Now, about Buddhism, he had been more than fair, but about, Hinduism, I think his data gathered by Marshall Moss and Henry Hubert was, a victim of bad translation and overgeneralization. You know what they are trying to do? Number one, they are trying to portray that Hindu society is a homogeneous society, which it is not, from the ancient times. Secondly, they are over-relying on Sanskrit sources. And I have said in one of my lectures that Tamil is much more older than the written Sanskrit, although Vedas, which are not written books, are much older than any grammar on earth. They are the first book on earth, but they were not written, They were books which were transformed in the oral tradition from Guru to the Shishya, from the teacher to the disciple. Now, what Durkheim is overgeneralizing, like Max Weber and Karl Marx, is that he is not taking into account different linguistic families in India. Sanskrit does not represent Hindu India or India in the geo-cultural sense. There are at least three linguistics families which are, constituent part of the Indian culture. One is the linguistic family called the Dravidian family, and in the Dravidian family of languages, we include Tamil, Telugu. Now Telugu is spoken in two styles, the Andhra style and the Nizam style. Now Nizam style is called Telangana style. And then you have Kannada, which is not a language like Tamil, but which is a language like Hindi. Now, what makes Hindi, different from other North Indian languages like Sanskrit, Punjabi, Bengali, Uriya, Maithili, Bhojpuri, is that Hindi has been borrowing enormously from different sources. And there are three types of words in the Hindi language. They are called tatsam, words which have come from Sanskrit, tadbhav, words which were Indianized over time from Sanskrit by making collaboration with the lingua franca of Pali, Prakrit and Apabhrans, that is called Tadbhav. Then they such, languages which had come from, Dravidian languages, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, Malayalam, etc., Tulu. These are called, and also, North Indian languages like Punjabi, Marathi, Bengali, Gujarati, Oriya. These are called Desaj. And then there is a fourth category of words in Hindi. It is called Videsaj. Hindi has incorporated large number of terms and words from non-Indic languages, including Persian, Arabic, Portuguese, Latin, Greek, German, French, and of course English. Now, Kannada is much more like Hindi. It is not, in Karnataka, people do not speak one language. There is a place called Kurg, which was studied by M.N. Srinivas. They have a different type of Kannada language, much more, related with Tulu. Then there are people of Nilgiri Hills, primarily the Todas, who have, their own language, which is not necessarily, something which has come from the Mundari language, the third language, the Aryan family of languages, the Dravidian family of languages, and the tribal languages which are called Mundari family of languages. Therefore, unless and until you take into account that there are three distinct, families of languages spoken in India, and secondly, among the Hindu society, there is not only the Brahminical view. Brahmins do not represent the whole of Hindu society. Therefore, what is written, in the Brahminical manuals of ritual need not necessarily be applicable to other castes, particularly in a very, important book edited by Milton Singer and B.S. Cohn. The name of the book is Entrepreneurship and Development of Occupational Culture in South Asia. They have said that this worldly asceticism is much more, culturally, historically rooted in India than in Europe. And they name, the groups like the Jains, the Marwadis, the Chettiars, and many other castes of the Indian subcontinent. Then, there is also an observation which was made by Louis Dumont and David Pocock in their different articles in contributions to Indian sociology when it was being published from Paris, that the other backward castes or the OBC of India are perhaps the most secular people in modern sense of the European term. The OBCs of India are much more secular than the Protestants of, Germany or France or England or United States of America. This is not me, but David Pocock and Louis Dumont. David Pocock has written a book, Mind, Body and Wealth. Mind, Body and Wealth. Now, anemic suicide, it is symptomatic of a chronic state in the modern economy. Anomic suicide is symptomatic of a chronic state in the modern economy. Anomic suicide rate is higher in the modern, industrial, urban, democratic, liberal societies or social solidarities called organic than other kinds of society or solidarities. How? Let us see. A. When individuals' needs and their satisfaction have been regulated by society, the individual becomes the embodiment of the collective conscience by learning. By the way, conscience is collective consciousness. Collective conscience in French is collective consciousness. I am reading it again. When individuals' needs and their satisfaction have been regulated by society, the individual becomes the embodiment of the collective consciousness by learning the common beliefs and practices through institutionalized socialization process from birth to death. I must thank some of you who have forced me to rediscover myself. I thought I cannot speak in slow motion. The credit of my this new style goes to online teaching and the friendly suggestion by some of you. Thank you, friends. B. When this regulation of the individual is upset, conditions for anomic suicide rate tend toward a maximum. The anomie or lawlessness, the literal sociological meaning of anomie is lawlessness, normlessness, chaos, some sort of, uncertainty around the validity of social norms, values, mores and folkways. These are words not spoken by Émile Durkheim but by an older sociologist of the United States of America, William Graham Sumner. The anomie or lawlessness or breakdown of the moral consensus may lead to unprecedented or pathological social, political, economic or military situations. See, for example, sudden wealth may be gained by a particular individual by pathological or anomic means due to legal or moral ambivalence. What is ambivalence? some sort of uncertainty, some sort of grey situation, whether this is right or wrong. See, sudden wealth may be gained by a particular individual by pathological or anomic means due to legal or moral ambivalence prevalent in that society. Now, ambivalence is one of the chief characteristics of anomie prevalent in society. In such anomic or pathological situation of social life, sudden gain of wealth may become a strong stimulus of anomic suicide on the ground that the newly enriched individual is unable to cope with the new opportunity afforded to him by the ill-gotten wealth. The upper and lower limits of his desires, his scale of life, all are upset. Therefore, please try to keep in mind, Durkheim is not saying that in anomie, poor people commit more suicide. Indirectly, he is saying the reverse. That suicide, anomic suicide, is much more prevalent among the neo-rich people in anomic situation where moral ambivalence or lawlessness or ambiguity is present. This is not the other way around. I said this in the case of farmer suicide in India, that it is not the chronically poor farmers of North India who commit suicide. Rather, they are the upwardly mobile, forward-looking, modern educated, modern in the sense Dipankar Gupta talks about mistaken modernity. This is upwardly mobile, more ambitious farmers of South India, primarily Maharashtra and undivided Andhra Pradesh, who commit anemic suicide when their higher aspirations are not met with the results on the ground, when their cash crops are destroyed, when their higher aspirations are destroyed because of multiple factors including market instability, then they commit suicide. The reason is not economic poverty. The reason is normlessness or anomie. Since, due to false advertisement, false propaganda, they left their age-old culture of forefathers. They were much more alienated with their orthodox, kins and affines. Kins are those related by blood and affines are those related by marriage. You will read about these things in the course on family and marriage in India, probably in the second semester or fourth semester. D. The same type of situation occurs in conjugal enemy. Conjugal husband-wife unit is called conjugal unit. Spouse. In the Indian term is grihast, the householder. The same type of situation occurs in conjugal enemy, exemplified by divorce. Here, marital or kinship society no longer exercises its regulative influence upon the partners. And the suicide rate for divorce is comparatively high. This anemic situation is more severely reflected among divorced men than among divorced women, since it is man who had profited more from the regulative influence of marriage. Now this is terribly important point. And no sociologist had, demonstrated this fact so effectively by following the method and technique of classical sociology as Durkheim has done. What he is trying to say that, in marital enemy, primarily, when married people, relocate to a place where they find neither kins nor affines, suicide rate is higher. But among the divorced partners, it is men who commit more suicide than women. Of course, he is talking about the global village, not about India. But in India also, the situation is not much different. Although the government data is first in India. For example, when there is a divorce in Indian society, there is no doubt that it is easier for a man to get remarried than for a woman, unless and until they are celebrities. For a normal woman, even dysfunctional marriage and anemic family has been much more tolerable than divorce. Why? Because India is a male-dominated society to a large extent today. It is much more male-dominated in urban spaces than in rural spaces, contrary to the popular belief. And after divorce, there is no doubt women are forced to feel some sort of guilt as if divorce is taking place in India because of the faults of women. But Durkheim is very, very clear. He said, and I am reading it again, this economic situation is more severely reflected among divorced men than among divorced women, since it is man who has profited more from the regulative influence of marriage. Usually, women in India, by and large, even today, do not prefer suicide. They do not like divorce, but even if they are divorced, they are much more resilient. They are much more realistic. They are much more, pragmatic than men. Why? In my own book, Symbols of Kinship Identity in a North Indian Village, I have found that even if women know that their husbands are not loyal to them, even if they know that their husbands are having affair with another woman, usually they will not initiate for divorce or divorce. It is usually the man who initiates the process of divorce in India. I am giving you two high-profile cases. The case of, and both high-profile cases are from film industry of India, Bombay. There is a very beautiful woman in India, Rekha Ganesan, or simply Rekha. She married 4 times officially, had affair with more men than 4, and she is not apologetic about it. She is just still alive. Although her 4th husband, Mukesh, I think he was Mukesh Gupta or Mukesh Agarwal, I do not remember the surname, he committed suicide within a year after the marriage. It was not studied sociologically, but there were sensational reports. I am giving you the second case, and that is of Aditya Chopra, son of Yash Chopra and the owner of Yash Raj Films, the most successful film company in Bombay. When he decided to marry for the second time with Rani Mukherjee, who had acted in some of the successful films of Jawaharlal banner produced by Aditya Chopra. It is widely reported, and this is reliable source. Both the father-in-law and the mother-in-law said, in case you are adamant, you can file for a divorce and remarry, but you will have no place in our house. And Payal Khanna, that is Payal Chopra, the divorced wife of Aditya Chopra, still lives in the ancestral family house, and during the lifetime of Aditya Chopra and Rani Mukherjee, even if they were married after the divorce of Aditya Chopra, were not allowed in the house. Secondly, Yash Chopra transferred his share to Payal Chopra, and in compensation, she got half of the share of Aditya Chopra also. Such cases are not exceptions in India. Of course, they are not the rules. But there are many people in India who will not necessarily side with the son in case they know the daughter-in-law had no fault. And although today Aditya Chopra is the CEO of Yash Raj Films, his ex-wife had 1.5 times more share than Aditya Chopra, and she had got the veto power because the younger son of Yash Chopra, namely Uday Chopra, who lives in United States of America, he also sides with the older woman than Rani Mukherjee. In case you rely cinema as a social document, then you will have this type of films in many languages of India, where the son has been penalized by the parents because they were trying to create enemy in the family. Enemy in the family. It is not question of divorce. It is a question of this social structure of family. You are trying to create normlessness. You are trying to create enemy in the family, which is not acceptable. Therefore, women in India after divorce commit suicide very, very less than the men. Although Durkheim has not written, but I would like to supplement that even in the case of anemic suicide, the male partner, married or unmarried, suffers from egoistic tendency. Therefore, I would like to say that although these are three ideal types of suicide etiology: egoistic, altruistic, and anemic, but in empirical situation you will find much more mixed cases. Now, let me outline in 3 sentences that Indian data is first. Now, there is no doubt that in certain parts of India there are, a system which is called dowry. It is not a traditional institution of India. It is a modern institution which came during the British rule and which came with the modern instrumental market in India. And there are many families which cannot afford a huge dowry in case they want to marry their daughters to a suitable guy. And then there are dowry deaths. Most, statisticians, related with the divorce data are male. No doubt about it. Therefore, dowry deaths are portrayed as, an example of altruistic suicide like sati of medieval times. But these are actually murders, not suicides. Therefore, one must be careful whether the claim is being made by the husband or his friends, sometimes also the families, that the woman has committed suicide, but it may be a case of murder. Unless and until you are sociologically sure, you should not, rely on the government data provided by our ministries. The time is up, and the chapter or the book is still unfinished. I think one more lecture or maybe 2 lectures. Thanks.